Hey, what's up everybody? Seja here, and I've been getting some questions lately around what I see as being probably one of the most important aspects of herbal medicine for us to understand, to study, and most importantly, to integrate into our work, both with people and with plants, and that is the dynamic around herbal energetics. And the big question that I get is, what the H is it? What is herbal energetics, right? What does that mean? Are we talking about some woo-woo, esoteric, spiritual thing? Are we talking about some subtle vibrational thing? Like, what are we talking about when we say herbal energetics? So I'd like to define herbal energetics here for you. I'd like to talk a little bit about what that means, how you can use it, how you can work with it, how you can learn about it within your plants, and why it's so important. So, you know, one of the things that I like to think about before I jump into the bulk of the content here is, you know, that herbal medicine in and of itself is basically the relationship between human beings and plants, right, from a medicinal context. And that relationship between people and plants in this healing context has evolved a lot over time. You know, the practice of herbal medicine now is significantly different than it was 200 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, right? The way, you know, the first human beings used plants medicinally is very, very different from the way we're doing it now. Now, of course, there's some similarities, but there's a lot of differences too. But one thing that we see in more, I would say, modern day herbal medicine, especially information that's strongly influenced by industry, right, by the whole natural products industry, the supplement world, is that there is a very strong focus on the biochemical aspects of herbs. And what we see is from, you know, modern science that a lot of people see the healing virtues of plants is based on constituents, right? That there's certain you know, biochemically active compounds in plants that are responsible for their medicinal properties. And that, you know, the way a lot of people look at it is that, you know, we need a certain percentage or a certain number of milligrams or whatever of those particular constituents in order for the plants to have that medicinal effect. And that ultimately leads to what is very common these days is what we call standardized extracts. You know, we see that, you know, very, very common in the herb world. You know, a good example is turmeric, right? Most turmeric, it's hard to just get straight turmeric. In a way, it's like most of what you see is 95% curcumin, right? And that is what we would refer to as a standardized extract. And so I mentioned this biochemical model because this is actually a relatively recent model of understanding plants. And what we see traditionally is that, you know, before science, before we had, or not necessarily before science, but before our current manifestation of science, you know, before we had high performance liquid chromatography and GC mass spectrometry and, you know, the advent of pharmacology and understanding plant chemicals, we had a very different model for understanding and assessing the medicinal virtues of plants. And this is what we would, what I tend to refer to as vitalist models, or what we might refer to as an energetic model of herbal medicine. And this is much more based on human sensory faculty, right? What we can see, touch, hear, smell, and taste in a medicinal plant, and by direct observation, of the healing effects that a plant has. And when we study these vitalist models of herbal medicine, those are really what we tend to consider to be the great traditions of herbalism. Ayurveda and Chinese medicine and Tibetan medicine and Greek herbalism or Greek medicine, and a lot of indigenous cultures recognize energetics, Unani Tib or Arabic medicine, to our great North American herbal traditions, the Thompsonian tradition, physiomedicalism, eclecticism, etc. They all understood their herbs and their people based on the functioning of the vital force of the plant and the vital force of the person. And the way the vital force expresses itself is through energetics. And when I say vital force, really what we're looking at is, the baseline intelligence behind the body, behind the plant, that is kind of determining the functioning of it, right? And so we use a language of energetics to understand how the vital force is working. And so this is the way pretty much all of our traditions of herbal medicine were based on. They didn't understand sesquiterpene lactones and iridoid glycosides, but they understood bitter. And they understood what bitter does in the body on a physiological level and on an energetic level, and that energetic level is ultimately influencing that physiological level. So what we tend to see universally across the board is the same exact pattern of herbal energetics. And what I like to see, and that's, whether we're studying Eastern herbalism or Western herbalism, indigenous herbalism, medical astrology, alchemy, whatever system you're looking at, they all really ultimately say the same thing. And that's that medicinal plants have certain qualities within them that interface with the state of our tissues and organs of the body. And the simplest way of understanding those qualities is there's three primary qualities that are typically looked at within a medicinal substance. And that is the quality of temperature, the quality of moisture, and the quality of tone. And each of these three qualities has a polarity, right? Meaning they have opposites. And ultimately, the way I think of it is what we're looking at here is we're looking at the elements, right? We're looking at earth, water, air, fire, and ether. And we're observing these elemental forces that ultimately are at the root of all of life. The elements are in everything. They generate everything. Nothing can exist unless it has these elemental forces within it. And that, that's across the board. I mean, the alchemists recognize that, the astrologers recognize that, the Vedics recognize that, the Taoists recognize that, even mystic Christianity recognizes that, right? That we see these elemental forces reflected literally in every culture that I've ever come across, whether that's medical culture or whether that's spiritual culture or whether that's even scientific culture. Because we have to remember that a lot of modern science is based off of alchemy, right? That a lot of the famous scientists that we learned about in elementary and junior high and high school, right? Those people were actually alchemists. And that, from Isaac Newton to Francis Bacon to a lot of these big names were actually practicing alchemy. It's unfortunate that we took this much of their work out of the context and kind of left the maybe more esoteric elements of their work on the fringes. But anyway, so we see that plants tend to have these different qualities within them. Every medicinal plant has a temperature quality, a moisture quality, and most of them will have a tonal quality, not all. But what we see here is in temperature, we have the grand polarity of hot and cold. So we have herbs that are going to warm up the tissues. They're going to increase that fire element within the body. or we have herbs that are cooling in nature, meaning they're going to decrease the fire element in the body. When we look at moisture, obviously we have damp, moistening herbs, and we have drying herbs, right? And these are going to affect, all of these are going to affect all the different organs and systems and tissues of the body. This is one organ system actually that's probably one of the more common organ systems for people to use herbal energetics. Maybe they're just not aware of it, is the respiratory system. You know the difference between a damp, wet, boggy, soggy, mucousy cough versus a dry, hacking, harsh, rib dislodging, dry cough, right? And if you know your plants and you take your expectorant category, you know that there's some expectorants that are very stimulating, very warming, very hot in nature that are used to dispel a cold, damp kind of respiratory condition, right? Like OSHA or elecampane or lomatium, right? These are all very pungent essential oil warming remedies, right? That break up and disperse, dry out dampness and warm up cold. Conversely, you know that there's demulcent, moistening, soothing, cooling kind of expectorants too, right? Like marshmallow root or plantain leaf or licorice root, right? These are all really good for a very hot, dry respiratory condition where you want to cool it down and you want to moisten it up. And if you've ever taken something like OSHA in a really hot, irritable, dry respiratory condition, it tends to be pretty aggravating. And if you take licorice in a really damp, boggy, moist, cold kind of respiratory condition, it also tends to be pretty aggravating. So that's the respiratory. I use the respiratory system as an example because it's pretty close to the surface of the body, and a lot of people really notice the effects of temperature and moisture on the lungs. You can really notice it. And if you haven't taken your expectorant herbs with that awareness, I highly encourage you to become aware of that. It's really takes your level of understanding of those remedies to a whole other level. Okay, so we have the hot-cold polarity, we have the damp-dry polarity, and then with tonal quality, what we see here is this dynamic around tension, or since we're looking at herbs, we would say tonic, which I'll define here in a moment. And then we have relaxed. So here we're looking at temperature, moisture, and then tone, we're looking at how tight or loose is the tissue, basically. And, we have remedies that will relax very tense tissues like during spasm or constriction, tension, right? When things are wound up too tight, you take an herb to kind of relax that tension. Conversely, if you have a tissue that's really loose and boggy, then we use a tonic, something to increase the tone, something to wind that guitar string up a little tighter, so to speak. So we're increasing the tone. From an energetic perspective, or an action perspective, we would say that's an astringent, and that is a relaxant. And predominantly with relaxants, we've got nervines, I don't know if I'm too low on the board here, and spasmolytics. And then so we can link our herbal energetics to certain herbal actions. So pungent hot remedies tend to be carminative. They tend to be we'll just say circulatory stimulants, but many of them are stimulants in general. Cold, the classic term would be refrigerant, but we see bitters are typically cold in nature. Damp herbs, moistening herbs, there we have our demulcent category. Drying herbs, we've got most herbs are drying. Basically, if it's not demulcent, it's drying. So a lot of herbal actions going. They're diaphoretic, diuretic, bitter, astringent, anything, most herbs, they make you pee more, they make you sweat more, they make you poop more, they drain fluids from tissues. Many herbs are drying in nature. So there's all sorts of different types of remedies that are drying, too many to list. I would say a majority of herbs actually are drying. And I'm going to shoot another video actually talking about that and why you really need to know this category. Very, very important for you to know your moistening herbs. And then under astringents are going to increase tone and relaxants are going to relax tone. So there we see kind of some basic differentials for how to understand a plant through this energetic model. And of course this relates to other models, right? Obviously something in to kind of link more Ayurvedic terminology here. We clean this up a little bit. So we can also use Ayurvedic terminology to understand these actions. So maybe I'll change colors. So something that's hot in Ayurveda is going to increase pitta. Something that's cooling is going to decrease pitta and possibly increase kapha and vata. Something that's going to increase dampness is going to increase kapha. And if it's oily, it will increase pitta, because pitta is also damp. But kapha tends to be more damp in water. Pitta tends to be more damp in oil. And moistening herbs will decrease vata because vata is dry and wants that moisture. Conversely, drying herbs are going to increase vata, which makes vata difficult to treat because a lot of herbs are drying. That's one reason why you got to know your moistening herbs. And they're going to decrease kapha and pitta. And obviously here warming is going to increase pitta and is going to decrease kapha and vata. Now our tension dynamic there, that's going to increase vata because vata tends to be tense, and it's going to decrease kapha because kapha tends to be relaxed. Conversely, this is going to decrease vata because we want to relax vata because they're tense, and it can increase kapha because kapha is already relaxed. So these are kind of some of the ways we might look at Ayurvedic terminology based on the 3 doshas of Ayurveda. And we can also look at the Chinese model, which they use the polarity of yin and yang and excess and deficiency. So hot is going to be yang excess, whereas cold is going to be yang deficiency. So the yang dynamic is actually looking at temperature, whereas yin is more looking at moisture. So damp would be yin excess and dry would be yin deficiency. And just for clarity's sake, no Chinese practitioner is going to say someone has excess yin. They're probably just going to call dampness. Now tension and relaxation, these are a little bit different. In general, I talked to some friends that are acupuncturists, Chinese medicine practitioners. They said tension could just be a general state of excess, over-tonified, and relax could be a general state of deficiency because there's a lack of energy in relaxed tissues. So here you'll notice I'm starting to translate a little bit between plants and people. So what's so critical about this energetic model is that it's not just about herbal energetics, it's about human energetics too. I think I combined those words, human energetics. Human energetics. So we can understand our remedies as being warming or cooling, moistening or drying, tonic or relaxant, but we can also understand people from that perspective. So what we see here is that these 6 dynamics generate what in our North American herbal traditions is called the 6 tissue states. And so we see that basically the body the organs and systems and tissues of the body can be understood through this energetic model as well. The same pattern, right? The same pattern of elements that is influencing the plants is also influencing us. And so this is what's so brilliant about a vitalist energetic model, is that you're using the same language to understand people and to understand plants. In that way, it makes it much easier to match them together. So I'm going to change a few of these words, and this I all learned from my one of my teachers, Matthew Wood, who wrote a great book on this exact subject called The Practice of Traditional Western Herbalism. That's by Matthew Wood. Highly recommended text. So our first tissue state is heat excitation, where tissues are overstimulated and hot and hypermetabolic. The opposite of that is cold depression, where there's decreased activity within the tissue. It's hypofunctioning. It's depressed in its physiological function. We have damp stagnation, where fluids congeal and congest and become toxic. This tissue state was also called torpor, which basically means toxic, and is in need of alternatives. We have dry atrophy, which is basically withering, weak, malnourished, emaciated, because fluids are what deliver nutrients. So when we have dryness, we tend to have withering, weakening, dry qualities there. This tissue state is, the way Matt teaches it, is what he calls wind tension. So this would be hypertonic, tension in the body, tension in the mind. So stress, anxiety, spasm, constriction, cramping, things like that. And things that are very changeable, symptoms that come and go. That's an aspect of wind, because sometimes it blows this way and that way and that way. And then this final tissue state is called damp relaxation. I really prefer to call it relaxation, because this damp confuses people, because there's like, wait, there's two damp. But the way I think of this is water stagnating, this is water overflowing. So a relaxed tissue can't hold fluids in. So excess sweating, excess urination, diarrhea. Diarrhea actually used to be called relaxation of the bowel. Organ prolapse, things like that, where the tissues are flabby and have lost their tone. So these are the 6 tissue states of the physiomedicalist. This was first discussed by Dr. Joseph Thurston in 1900 in his book on physiomedicalist philosophy. So these 6 tissue states basically are our Western equivalent of Ayurvedic tridosha theory, of Chinese organ system energetics, of our Greek humoral theory of phlegmatic, melancholic, sanguine, and choleric, the classic 4 constitutions of Galenic or Greek medicine. This is our North American equivalent. This is our Western herbal energetic tradition. And a lot of people for years said, oh, the West doesn't have an energetic model. We got to use Chinese or Ayurvedic. And it's not true. And I tip my hat to the work of both Matthew Wood and Paul Bergner, 2 of my main herb teachers that really anchored the energetic model firmly into my mind. I am a huge proponent of using herbal and human energetics, because it makes your practice of herbal medicine significantly more specific. The reason being is that from a Western diagnostic perspective, someone in more Western biomedicine might diagnose someone as having bronchitis. Maybe they diagnose 2 people as having bronchitis. So you've got, from the Western perspective, the same disease, but one person's bronchitis might be hot and dry. They might have heat excitation and dry atrophy, whereas another person might have bronchitis with cold depression and damp stagnation. As an herbalist, you're going to treat those very, very differently. So this basically enables you to get much more specific in your evaluation of a person, because we don't diagnose, we holistically evaluate and assess. Very important language distinction there. We never diagnose, we assess and evaluate. And that gets you more specific in your remedy selection, and formulation. So that way you're choosing the remedies that match the person. And one of the cool things that I have found in my own studies and research and work with herbs is that when you couple energetics of plants with actions, that's the key right there. You gotta know both. So when you know that an herb is expectorant, you know that it's going to have an affinity for the lungs and facilitate in the cough reflex and removal of phlegm and mucus from the lungs, and it just has this respiratory action. But when you look up expectorants, like I said earlier, you're going to see Osha elecampane, plantain, licorice, balsam root, lomatium, elderberry, horehound, mullein, marshmallow, pleurisy root, and plus dozens more, right? Tons of expectorants. But all of those remedies I mentioned are very, very different, right? Lobelia and licorice and Osha are all very different plants, but they're all expectorant. But you're going to use them for a really different kind of respiratory condition based on energetics. Osha you're going to use for the cold or damp cough, right? Licorice you're going to use for the dry cough. Lobelia you're going to use for the tense cough. So you can couple the energetics with the action. So you have relaxant expectorants like lobelia, you've got stimulant expectorants like Osha, and you've got demulcent expectorants like licorice, or moistening expectorants. So you're coupling the temperature, moisture, and tone quality of the herbal energetics with the action and affinity. And now you have a very holistic understanding of what that herb is doing in the body on a physiological and vital level. So you're not just knowing like, oh yeah, licorice, it's good for the lungs. Well, how is it good for the lungs? Why is it good for the lungs? What kind of lung condition is it specific for? So like I always say, it's best to not know what an herb is good for, but who that herb is. To look at how is that herb shifting the physiological functioning of the body that then leads to it being good for a particular kind of condition. So I just wanted to break down herbal energetics for you here and kind of look at some of the more universal patterns behind herbal energetics based on tradition, and how, ultimately this is not in contradiction to a biochemical model either, right? That we can understand certain types of constituents and how they work on these tissue states. So it's an integrative model that we don't have to throw science away and just go back to a vitalist model. No, we can bridge them together. And when we bridge them together, we have a more holistic understanding of what our herbal medicines are doing. So I would love to hear what you think, your thoughts, questions, comments, concerns, anything, post it below. If you're watching this anywhere other than my blog, go there right now, check it out, evolutionaryherbalism.com. We've got tons of other videos on the blog there, free mini courses where I give you more in-depth training for free, and lots of other goodies on there. If you are not familiar with our podcast, check it out. The Plant Path is our new podcast that we are now running. Very exciting news. And let me know what you think. Hit the like button, hit that share button with anyone that is herbally inclined. Thanks so much for checking this one out. Until next time, take care and be well.